Can't keep the lights on? Well, the Eskom CEO resorts to humor and idioms. We bring you Andre Dreiter's explanations to critical questions journalists asked him today. And to go big or not, hours before Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana tables his medium-term budget statement, an academic weighs in on the basic income grant debate. But first, we speak to someone who believes coalitions for hung municipalities are entirely unnecessary. Evans believes the law, as it stands, offers a lot more than what coalitions would ever give. That's all coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts now. It's a race against time as, political parties try to negotiate coalition arrangements for the 66 municipalities where no single party got more than 50% of the vote. Now, one man who believes that the law as it stands actually provides for a much better solution if only politicians can stop being politicians. Michael Evans is an attorney at Weber Wenzel. He has been involved in local government legal work since 1994. He joins me now via Zoom. Michael, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. And this is something, by the way, we explored a bit while we were still at the National Results Center with a couple of people who actually shared a similar view with you on this. Just very briefly, what does the Municipal Structures Act actually, put on the table in situations like the one we are finding ourselves in now, where 66 of our municipalities are hung because no single political party was able to, win an outright majority?
Good evening, Rio, and to your viewers as well. Thanks very much. The Municipal Structures Act has two systems of government at a local level, and all the municipalities throughout the country over the past couple of decades, or at least almost all of them, have adopted the executive mayoral system, which is really a winner-takes-all system, where the executive mayor has significant power, appoints a mayoral committee, and almost always the mayoral committee members come from the same party as the executive mayor. Now, where you have a situation where you have hung councils, you're going to get into these very intense and heavy debates, and these coalition agreements might be reached between parties that really don't coalesce very well. And I've always thought that there is a better system of local government, which is provided for in the Municipal Structures Act, but hasn't been adopted throughout the country very much. And that's the collective executive system. And what that involves is an executive committee, which is the controlling body in the council. The mayor, in that case, only has ceremonial powers and functions. But the collective executive committee is then made up on a proportional basis with the different political parties being represented on that committee. And when I look at local government, the way I see it is it should really be depoliticized, local government. It's not the same as national and provincial government. Its focus should be on one issue and one issue only, and that is service delivery. It should be focusing on water, electricity, housing, waste, etc. And we could do that more effectively, I feel, if we have a collective executive system. So let me just give an example. If we take the Johannesburg situation at the moment, where we've got the hung council, if we had a collective executive committee, then the ANC would have 4 representatives, the DA would have 3, Action SA would have 2, and the EFF would have 1. And that would be the leadership structure on the council. So there are lots of checks and balances in the process then, because we've seen so much ineptitude and so much corruption in our municipalities throughout the country. And I think there would be less scope for that if we had a leadership structure which was represented by the various major political parties, not dominated by one political party.
Two things there, even before one actually looks probably at the deeper and wider ones. But two quickly spring to mind. One is mayors in terms of, the current, the system that people have been using of an executive mayor. Are these very powerful people, and that's what I was referring to earlier when I said, if politicians can stop being politicians, because they just love power, so being this very powerful a person, especially if you are the leader of your party in the region, gives you, like enormous power. And of course, with that, you can then add, those who then serve as MMCs, usually from the same political power, are obviously in charge of, the various areas, that they have been given. And often with that then comes the ability to dispense patronage and do a whole lot of other things. And that's where sometimes corruption also comes into play, because they're actually in charge, they are responsible, they know what's coming, they know how much money is there, which then means that they have less of an incentive to give, such positions to people from other political parties. Or am I oversimplifying it?
Correct. No, I don't think I think you're spot on, Vuyo. And I think when you look at the power of those executive mayors, they do have a significant power to dispense patronage and other things. When you go to the collective executive system, the mayor merely plays a sort of ceremonial role. It's not a leading political role at all. They chair meetings and they, cut ribbons and whatever. But they don't have any significant power, because the power lies in that collective executive committee. And in that collective executive committee, you have the various parties represented. So even if you have a council which is not a hung council, where there's a majority party that, let's say, has 6 out of 10 on the collective executive committee, there will still be representatives of the opposition parties on that collective executive. So there'll be much less scope for the kind of patronage and corruption which we've seen in so many municipalities.
But then there have been, or we've at least heard of cases where if party A is or has the highest number of, even though you have an executive mayor, but they have the highest number of councillors who serve on that ex-mayoral committee. You still have some of them, party B, which gives them the numbers, able to negotiate a deal whereby they kind of become in charge or responsible for a corner or two, maybe 3. And there is an understanding there that they can do pretty much what they want, or can do pretty much what the party that has the highest number, can actually do. In other words, you still have the smaller parties like being able to be as corrupt in certain instances as the biggest party among them. Then what you're trying to take care of by bringing many parties to the party, actually doesn't happen, because, the second or third largest party has said, you're giving us this portfolio and you leave us alone.
Yeah, look, it's not a guarantee against corruption and patronage happening in councils. I just think it's a better system of checks and balances. And certainly in a coalition, you're going to get a couple of parties in that coalition. And maybe in a coalition under an executive mayoral system, you will have a couple of parties represented on the mayoral committee. But you do then often have a situation where smaller, very tiny parties become kingmakers and have much more power than they should have because they're a kingmaker in those coalition negotiations. And I don't think that's ideal either, because they haven't got significant support in terms of the election process, and yet can assume quite significant power through the coalition process. Under the collective executive system, that wouldn't happen, because it would only be the larger parties that are represented on the executive committee.
You know, I mean, only yesterday we had a couple of the smaller parties, you know, updating us on the negotiations, conversations that have been having with your ANCs and your DAs and your EFF. Patriotic Alliance, for example, makes no secret of the fact that they want power. And they don't hide the fact that they believe, even if they have one councillor, and that councillor is what will make the municipality to work or collapse, they are not ashamed of the stance that they have taken, that precisely because they can give you that one councillor that will enable you to take decisions or not, or pass budgets, you know, they are going to use it, you know, they are going to milk it for what it's worth, you know. So I'm thinking of a situation where you have a whole host, you know, of parties agreeing, but because they need that one or two councillors from other political parties that, let's say, adopt the same or a similar attitude to that I've just described by the Patriotic Alliance, for example. There may be situations where it may not matter, you know, whether you have parties that are keen, willing and able to coalesce, you know. Just the sheer number, because it's a sheer numbers game at the end of it all, you may then find that one spoiler who is prepared to collapse things if things don't go their way. I mean, even what is provided for in the Municipal Structures Act doesn't prevent that, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I mean, you're absolutely right. You can get a party. I mean, you mentioned the Patriotic Alliance. They have one seat in the Tshwane municipality, for example. Now, it would be wrong for a party that has one seat in a huge metropolitan municipality to be able to exert significant power just because they are a kingmaker and they're the key factor in that coalition having a majority in that council. I think it would be far better to have the major parties. I mean, if we look at Tshwane, then that would be the ANC, the DA, the EFF, Action SA, and the Freedom Front Plus. Those would be the parties that would make up the executive committee. They've got significant representation on that council, and it would be right that those parties are the ones that are dominating the decision making within the leadership of the council, rather than a party that has one seat out of over 200 seats.
Someone was saying last week that you know, what is provided for in the Municipal Structures Act, you know, is what you've seen happening, especially in places in KwaZulu-Natal, where these, you know, coalitions were like sort of started being put together back in the day when the you know, ANC was running the I mean, was able to speak to the IFP, and they could find one another and strike deals. And I remember the other day, Tony Leon also referred a bit to those arrangements. And I mean, someone I was talking to at Salga, and Tony Leon sort of gave certainly give the impression that what is being proposed, what you are talking about, is what actually saved the day in places like KwaZulu-Natal, with all the history that we all know we're not going to get into right now. But what, in your view, as someone who's been following these black events since 1994, what made those coalitions in KwaZulu-Natal, more specifically, to actually work?
Look, I'm not a political analyst, and I'm also not from KwaZulu-Natal, so I'm not aware of the detail there. But I think where you do have two parties that maybe are just short of a majority and where their objectives are similar, and where they're focusing equally on important service delivery questions, then it is possible that you could have a coalition between those parties and that it would work. But we don't always see it in that situation, and we've had situations like Johannesburg under a coalition of the DA and the EFF who were so far apart, and it really didn't work. We saw the similar in Nelson Mandela Bay and Gqeberha, where there was a coalition in place which didn't work and ultimately fell apart, and the municipality really suffered as a consequence. So I think the positive and well-working coalitions are going to be the exception rather than the rule. And I think, in some cases, yes, they will work. And if there are coalitions in South Africa, in our metropolitan and other municipalities, hopefully they will work, because we need them to work. We need service delivery. We need to restore things at a local government level, which have been destroyed over the past couple of decades. So hopefully they will work. But I do think we've got a better opportunity for local government working effectively if we do have the collective executive system where all the main parties are represented at a leadership level.
Well, the tragedy, of course, about coalitions that don't work is that the politicians often sort themselves out, and not a lot, it's actually the people on the ground who suffer, because then either the unstable government, look out for, their narrow, needs that have nothing to do with the people, and if they can't get that, they're prepared to collapse things because they can. They always find a way of blaming one another, or someone finds a way of blaming the other person, and none of them ever get to take responsibility. Isn't perhaps the way to go then to kind of refine, perhaps the Municipal Structures Act, and actually find a way of forcing, political parties to somehow, find a way of cooperating one another, or is it reruns, perhaps the only way then they can get around. I know that Jeff Radebe from the ANC has hinted as much that they are not going to go out of their way to beg people who are not willing to cooperate. If need be, then people will have to just go back and do a rerun of elections in certain instances.
Well, I don't think a rerun is going to be a solution at all. I've heard that mention of that in a couple of places. It's not a simple process that one has to go through. It would have to be a process through Section 139 of the Constitution, where the provincial government eventually appoints an administrator over that council. So it's not a simple process. But I don't think there's any chance that a rerun of election would produce an outright winner. You take a place again like Nelson Mandela Bay, where the ANC got 39% of the vote and the DA got 39% of the vote. What is the chance that in a fresh election, one of those is going to get over 50%? It's virtually nil. So I don't think a fresh election is going to help. Then you raised the possibility of amending the Municipal Structures Act. That would be one option, but that's a long-term option. Amending legislation in this country is a long and slow process.
The grinds
it could take a couple of years.
The mills tend to grind very slowly.
But what I'm suggesting, is we could move to a collective executive system in the space of a month. The provincial minister simply has to go out and get comment from the municipality that is being referred to, and from the South African Local Government Association, SALGA, and from the general public. Give them an opportunity to comment on the possibility of a new system. And once the provincial minister has received that comment, he or she can then determine that particular municipality will now move from an executive mayoral system to a collective executive system. It's happened before. It's happened the other way. The city of Cape Town operated on a collective executive basis until the early 2000s, when it moved from collective executive to executive mayoral. It's not a complex process to shift from the one to the other.
But then what becomes the role of vested interest? Remember, naivety is not the word, but when things started, people were amenable, to, ideas and things that would actually make municipalities or provincial governments or even national governments work. Then somewhere a lot of things happened, and you'd find that a lot of people now are actually less amenable, to all good things of this world that are supposed to be about the people, that are not supposed to be about individuals or political parties. We've seen just how ruthless some people have actually become in the pursuit of money or power and such things. Are we saying that this system, in terms of or the way it is in the Municipal Structures Act, it's as simple as the MEC coming along and saying, look guys, we've got to go this way, and there will hardly be any resistance from those who obviously, have a stake or who want to pursue their own agendas?
There's very little scope for resistance. There's an opportunity to comment, but ultimately it is the decision of the provincial minister, which means effectively it'll be a decision of that political party controlling the province. So it would be the ANC in 8 of the 9 provinces, and it would be the DA in the Western Cape that would have to take the decision to go down that path. Not necessarily in all municipalities, but at least in those, 66 municipalities that have hung councils at the moment. And it wouldn't involve a difficult process at all. I think it's a move away from a winner takes all. We have a situation where, as you know, where the majority of people in this country didn't vote. So there is an indication of disillusionment with the current system of local government.
Well, you and I know that, but the politicians don't. or prefer not to, appreciate that fact. But then doesn't the fact that you have 8 provinces being, controlled by the ANC, which means that it will be ANC MECs who then get to decide that, give, especially the small parties, even more reason or grounds to, put up resistance, precisely because it's going to, prevent them from doing or from being the kingmakers they actually want to be.
But they would have little scope for having any influence on the decision. And I think if the ANC and the DA in the Western Cape were to take a decision even together and say, well, let's look at our 66 hung councils, and instead of going the coalition route, let's shift in this direction. It would be very, very hard for that to be opposed. As I say, there's only an opportunity to comment, but it's the decision of the provincial minister.
And in terms of this arrangement, how accommodative or how generous can the big parties really be? Does it have to follow a very specific formula, or can they just decide among themselves, have an agreement that says, okay, we'll accommodate as many of the partners as possible, and maybe, is there room for flexibility and, pacifying some partners who may be louder and more disruptive than others?
There's a little bit of room for flexibility. What the Structures Act says is that you have 2 options. You either go a strict proportionality basis. Now, your executive committee has a maximum of 10, and most of the metros it's 10 and a minimum of 3, depending on the size of the metro. So the first option is to go the proportionality route, and that's the logical route to go, especially where you have hung councils, because it then becomes just an arithmetical exercise. But the Act does say that you can look at an alternative system to a proportional one, but the alternative system has to comply with Section 160, brackets 8 of the Constitution, which says that the different parties must be fairly represented. So even if you look at something slightly different from a proportional representation, you still have to have fair representation. And there was a court case in the Western Cape in relation to precisely that issue about 15 years ago.
And does it also provide for, because for most of the time over the past 5 years, this is where the problem was. Does it provide for some deadlock breaking mechanism, or what happens when there are conflicts which there have been many over the past 5 years, is that adequately provided for?
Well, let's assume again a hypothetical situation where we had a collective executive in Johannesburg, and as I said, it would involve 4 ANC, 3 DA, 2 Action SA, and 1 EFF. And let's assume you had the EFF and ANC aligning on the one side and the DA and the Action SA on the other, and there was a 5-5 split, and they couldn't reach an agreement on a key issue, let's say like a budgetary issue or something like that. Then there's not a mechanism to rule one way or the other. What they would have to then do is go back to the council and to the councillors and to the 200 councillors and say, these are the 2 issues. We couldn't reach agreement on this central issue. You as a council need to take a decision, and the council would then take the decision.
Michael, thank you very much for your time and for your insights this evening.
Thank you, Vera.
Michael Evans is an attorney at Weber Wenzel. He has been involved in local government legal work for years now. He reckons that, there is a mechanism in terms of the Municipal Structures Act, which actually allows for a better system than the one political parties are busy trying to negotiate among themselves, which among its weaknesses is the fact that the small parties tend to be, kingmakers, and often they overplay their hand. The result of that then becomes instability. This coalition government really never gets to hold. By the way, they have, I think, about 14 days to put these coalition governments together, or, of course, other legislative provisions kick in. After the break, to go big or not, an academic weighs in on the basic income grant debate ahead of tomorrow's medium-term budget statement. Don't go away. If social assistance to the less privileged is constitutionally mandated, why are we even arguing about social grants? Is it purely a question of a lack of affordability or lack of political will? Well, Professor Phakama Njongwana has been investigating the role of the government's emergency economic and social relief measures, as well as exploring ways government could provide basic income support. She's based at the Nelson Mandela University, and she joins me now. Good evening, Prof. Thanks very much for your time. Well, we've heard everyone, including those opposed, to the idea, because they're raising a whole host of other problems that it'll bring with. People saying, no, there's actually a need. There's actually a need. However, we simply cannot afford it. Is that the case?
Yeah.
From the work you've done?
Well, I think that we have no choice now as a country but to provide some kind of basic income support. I mean, from 20 years ago, the country started speaking of the basic income grant, where a wealth tax was considered. And now, the corporate tax, I think now it's about 27%. It keeps going down, and next year it's going to be, next financial year in April, it's going to be 27%. That could be considered as well to fund social security for people in deep poverty. And some studies now are demonstrating that the PIC could, if it could fund the BBBEE, it could also fund people living below the poverty line.
Well, the challenge, over the years has always been, the lone voices, you academics, activists, social activists, unions, and the like, whose ideas hardly ever find expression in how the budget is being put together. Of course, and the whole point about having this conversation tonight is that in a matter of hours, the finance minister is expected to say something about the government's attitude towards a basic income grant. But then the fact remains, well, up until now, the experience has been that your voices and that of activists, unionists, and social justice activists never really find expression in how Treasury and those powerful people think.
Yes, well, civil society plays a very critical role in putting pressure on government to provide social security, because of course it's a constitutional mandate. Black Sash and the Institute for Poverty and Inequality are now considering, joining forces and trying to see if they can actually take government to court to provide this basic income grant, should it not be announced tomorrow. So those are very important voices that reflect a pluralistic society, as we hope that we have, and that real change will come. And of course, there are some skeptics who would say, and I'm a bit skeptical as well, that this basic income grant mustn't be announced just because the ruling party didn't perform well at the polls. It must be a genuine effort for for government to be more inclusive of people. It can't exclude half the population of South Africa. That puts all of us in detriment, not only the people that are struggling, but all of us as a country. The studies that show correlation between crime and deep poverty. It's right now it's a must, and it's a constitutional mandate.
But isn't that part of the problem? I mean, should it matter whether the ANC lost an election or continues to lose one election after the other? Because part of the problem, something we haven't done, as a nation, has been to actually put timelines to some of these things. You'll find that, which is the case, and you alluded to this when you started, the fact that we've been talking about this for a very long time, and because we don't put timelines to these things, to when they should be implemented and what the price we pay for not doing them or doing them on time. You get these new arguments now about the fact that, COVID has been with us, so this is the worst time to introduce something like that because the economy hasn't done well. Perhaps, starting to put timelines on these things is one way we can get, those in power to actually move with speed without waiting for their misfortunes, before we get them to do things.
Yeah, I think that if anything, the COVID pandemic has demonstrated that we really need to have a more humanitarian approach in dealing with citizens or with South Africans at large, because if you take spatial issues, for example, that were experienced by people living in informal settlements during COVID, you'd find that if somebody infected in a family or in a household was able to quarantine, like we did in suburbs, then less members of that household would be infected with the pandemic and even, come to loss of life. So really, if anything, this pandemic has really demonstrated that the government needs to move on this, and and not have parsimonious amounts like the child support grant, which is like I think 460 per month for a child, and it has no caregiver component to it. So if a mother receives that 460 and does not have food herself to eat, I've spoken to low-income mothers, single mothers, who don't lose strength just in a day because they cannot look after their children because of food insecurity, but there's this 460. So what ends up happening is that in household where there's an old age grant coming in, that becomes a family grant and is shared amongst the family, compromising the needs of the elderly. Both related to mental health issues and physical well-being of the elderly. So we're hoping that tomorrow something positive will come through, and that it won't be just for 6 months, or that it will be more long-lasting and more that deep structural change that government is making, genuine structural change. Because you don't want people anxious that in 6 months' time, this is going to run out. What happens after that, And if I may, Vuyo, please, just point out that empirical evidence shows that people in receipt of social grants actually have a strong attachment to the labor market. So those grants not only get injected back into the economy, but people use some of that money to go and look for jobs and find work. So the whole dependency culture thesis that people are lazy, and when they receive the social grants, they won't want to work. I mean, who doesn't want to work after receiving 460 rands for a child per month? It's quite, it's demeaning, really.
All those arguments of a welfare state.
Yeah, just the disdain shown towards the well-being of citizens, just because they happen to be low-skilled, happen to be jobless. And of course, this narrative wasn't there when the state maintenance grant, the racially stratified state maintenance grant under apartheid was given. And in 1995, Vuyo, that was 410 rands for a parent or a caregiver, and then 127 rands for each child, I think up to 6 children in a family, and that was in 1995. Now we're in 2021, and the child support grant, which is received mainly by Black African families, is 460, and there's a narrative, a discourse that it's not deserved and that people are drinking it away, people don't want to work. But with the state maintenance grant, mostly received by white people, that narrative wasn't there.
Well, I mean, all the interesting things that the people who actually take those decisions or adopt the ideas you've just spoken about are supposedly deeply rooted in the struggle for, the liberation of the people of this country. You would have thought that the ideas they come up with solutions to whatever problems we have, are anchored in their belief system, but also take into account our history. Yes, we're not saying people should throw money at problems, but, they're actually paid to think. They are paid to come up with ideas. They are paid to lead, and it is actually their responsibility and not take shortcuts, or come up with very simplistic, solutions to what are big problems that are deeply rooted in our past.
Yes. We can't forget. Of course, we can't be ahistorical and forget the apartheid legacy. I mean, a lot of Black African people are still living along the Group Areas Act lines where they are far from national roads. They can't access healthcare. They can't access decent education for their children. And as you say, Vuya, that the very people in government who fought for us to be where we are, for our hard-earned democracy, really played a critical role in centering dignity in the Constitution, right? The protection of people's dignity. And of course, I mean, it's no brainer, and there is empirical evidence that demonstrates that there is a correlation between the erosion of dignity and poverty. So yes, you're quite right that at the center of it all is human rights and dignity, because it has become a humanitarian issue at this stage.
Professor Phaka Machongwana from the Nelson Mandela University. Thank you very much for your time. Of course, we're all looking forward to that medium-term budget statement the finance minister is expected to deliver tomorrow afternoon. After the break, from flogging dead horses yesterday to second-hand cars and open-heart surgery today, 2 days in a row, Eskom CEO Andre de Ruyter resorting to idioms to explain rolling blackouts. Load shedding, not blackouts, as he corrected us today. That's coming up after the break. Eskom CEO Andre de Ruyter yesterday addressed a media briefing to explain the load-shedding crisis. Now, you may remember his answer to calls for his resignation.
I do not intend to resign of my own accord. I think what is important to emphasize, though, is there's this lovely saying in English that you can flog a dead horse. You can even go one step further and you can change the jockey on the dead horse. But that will not necessarily solve the problem.
Flogging a dead horse. Now, it hardly ever happens that you get an organization CEO addressing a media briefing for 2 days in a row. I suppose if you can't keep the lights on, you turn on the humor, even dark humor at that. Now, today he was asked whether Eskom's maintenance issues were being addressed on the ground by professionals who know what they're doing. What I can tell you is that he did stay away from horses today.
When you want to do open heart surgery, do you put an ad in the newspaper and go for the lowest of the bids that you receive from qualifying surgeons? And that really is part of the discussion that we are having with National Treasury to ensure that, as Jan explained at length yesterday, when you drive let's call it a luxury German automobile, that you take it for a service at an appropriately accredited and trained facility with the right mechanics employed. To put your car out for repair when you go for the lowest of 3 quotes really does not yield the best and most appropriate maintenance outcomes.
Luxury German automobiles and heart surgery. Now, if you ever wanted to know just how much money Eskom needs or might need to fix its problems once and for all, this here was Mrs. Ruyter's answer.
We need to buy a new car. It just costs too much to fix the old car. And this is exactly the opportunity that we've got with the money made available as a first step following on the commitments made at COP26.
Light at the end of the tunnel, you be the judge. Have a good night. See you tomorrow.